Hello everyone, welcome back to the AAS YouTube channel, and this is the good stuff. This is the AAS Journal Author Series, and I'm super happy to have Daina Bouquin with us today. Hey Daina.
Hello.
How are you
Happy to
today?
be here. Doing okay, hanging in there.
Good. Where are you at? What's your geolocation?
Yeah, I am just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, so Melrose, Massachusetts. It's plenty hot here today.
I bet it's not as hot as Phoenix. We're gonna hit the 117Fs today. But on the other hand, we don't quite have that East Coast humidity, so.
No, when I hear numbers like that, I was born in Buffalo, New York, and when I hear numbers like that, that's just crazy to me. Like, that can't be real. You're lying to me. But no, I would not survive.
Maybe you feel better if they were negative. Oh, it's going to be minus 117. Yeah, it's Buffalo.
And, you know, whatever.
Cool. Is the CFA, how you guys doing on opening? Is it opening yet? Opening slowly?
We're in kind of a in-between phase. So initially it was very locked down for anything other than the labs. So only people who absolutely needed to be there were there. And this week, actually, we just started being able to send people in more regularly, but we're only at about, I think it's like 25% capacity. I have a few people who are going in just a few days a week for a few hours, but it's progress. So has not ground to a complete halt.
Yes. So yeah, ASU, we're slowly opening. They've developed an in-house active test for the virus, and so actually I just did one yesterday. It involves just saliva into a tube, but the plan is to open August 20th on mostly remote. There will be some hybrid and some in person, so it'll be interesting to see as we slowly open. Cross fingers.
Yeah, I mean, good luck.
So Daina, what do you like to do for research?
Well, I like to do for research, it's kind of a because I think that it's hard to explain sometimes to astronomers what information science or library and information science research is about. But a lot of what my research is focused on is kind of facilitating work by other people. That sometimes takes the form of looking into like new infrastructure, services, that kind of thing. But a big part of what I focus on is actually metadata infrastructure. So all of the information about the information that makes it so you can find and attribute and identify the objects that the community creates. And the whole goal is to kind of lower barriers that impact your ability to do your work and for other people to be able to use your work. And I do also do some historical research as well. Cool.
So for people who don't know, what is your current position?
I'm the head librarian at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics.
Cool.
And I'm employed by both Harvard University and the Smithsonian Institution. Separate jobs, separate paychecks, the whole 9 yards.
Wow, okay.
Gotta wear both hats.
2 hats. Well, that is a great topic, and in fact, that's going to lead us into this really lovely APJS article on a topic near and dear to my heart. Credit lost. 2 decades of software citation in astronomy. Daina, take us away.
Yeah, so I think the motivation behind putting together a paper like this and why we would put it in an astronomy journal is worth pointing out a bit. As I'm sure most of you know, that software is really important to contemporary astronomy and astrophysics research, and pretty much all of science, honestly. The world, let's just say the entire world runs on software. Yeah, so that's like a safe thing to say. But I think the history of digital publication is, in the long tail of things, not a very old thing. And until now, it's been really easy to translate the print publishing model in terms of attribution into a digital landscape. So we've been able to say, okay, well, if you cite a book, when you did that when journals were in print, you're doing it pretty much the same way now that journals are digital. You're using slightly different tools, but the convention hasn't changed. It's still appropriate to cite a journal article when you use it, or to cite a book chapter or something like that. But software's importance has not been very long established, and there aren't really norms around how to give people credit, who should get credit, the mechanics of actually doing a citation. Those things are not as obvious, and it's an easy thing to overlook because you just think like, oh, well, you just cite it. Don't you just say what it was and put that in, make a citation? But it doesn't always occur to people to cite software, and software's been around and been important in astronomy for a while now.
Yep.
So we thought doing a retrospective analysis on how people have actually been giving software credit would be worthwhile, because you can't really understand how to make the system better if you don't know what the current landscape of it is, right?
Absolutely.
So I think the first thing we wanted to do was to figure out like what are the problems with software citation right now? Like what is the reason why this is worth studying? And I mean, you said that you have developed software for a long time too. Do you have any kind of past history of people citing your software, citing your work?
Yes.
Okay, so did you have to tell them how to do it?
In my specific case, in general, no, because adopted a hybrid model where it was both the astronomy and the software. So describing capabilities of the software to do astronomy. And so there was a tangible, and we like to call them software instrument papers. So there was a very specific papers, as the case may be, for my current projects. And so it gave something people were familiar with citing to do it. And so to cite the software, they had a software instrument paper to cite.
Yeah. So that actually, if you scroll down a little bit, that's a good way to get into the topic of citing something else. So there's a section that says citing something else. So a little background about persistent identifiers, I'll get into that. But this section 2.3, essentially, because the astronomy community is very used to citing papers and not very used to citing software, a norm developed. This isn't something anyone told people to do. It's not something that publishers started giving instructions on how to do, but people basically started to hack the system. So instead of citing software, instead of citing code, citing code that has an identifier that's citable, that has specific people and dates and histories timed to it, people started basically creating these proxies for the software. Software papers, lots of different versions of what software papers are.
Right.
And so this process developed, and there's a bunch of ways people have basically cited things that are not software to cite as a way of citing software.
Correct.
And so why would you not want to do that? This creates a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of reasons why you don't necessarily want to have something be a proxy for the thing you're actually talking about. And I think that unless you're in the land where you chase citations, it might not be obvious to you. For instance, you don't contact, so I'm a librarian, you don't contact the librarian if you can Google it, right? You don't bother asking us for something if you can find it easily.
Right.
So you might contact us if you've got like a citation to something you can't find, for instance.
Yes.
This is something that comes up a lot. And if a citation is to something like a paper, we can usually hunt it down. And if the citation is to something that is not a paper, then it's a little harder. So you see why people are like, yeah, I'll cite the paper. It's stable. It's a thing that I know people are going to be able to find and look at it and has my name on it. But if I cited Moby Dick, if I cited the book Moby Dick, and then you followed my citation, and the thing you found was not a novel by Herman Melville, and instead it was someone's report about Moby Dick.
Okay, yes.
You would be really kind of confused and upset, right? So your thing that you've actually put as your breadcrumb is not the thing that you're talking about. And that thing that you're talking about might also not have a direct link to the actual thing that you're looking for.
Right.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So that's kind of like step one, is it's not actually the thing that you want. It's not the actual artifact, is the way that we refer to it as. So it's not the digital object that you actually need.
Right.
It's some kind of proxy for it. On top of that, the software paper itself is a static object. So it's a thing that's not going to change over time. AAS now has some kind of interesting approaches to making it so you can do additive authorship and changes to papers, but generally these are static objects, meaning they're not changing anymore, they're done, but software is not static.
No, and by the time the paper is published, it's already out of date.
Exactly.
Assure you.
Exactly. So you have these objects standing in for the thing you actually want, and they don't really represent the thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all bad. So they're out of date, they are static, and the bigger problem that we got into with our paper is credit. So people build software. You need to give people credit for the work that they do. And authorship lists change when you're actually developing code.
Yep.
So you're going to have new contributors. You're going to have different kinds of ways that people contribute. You have different versions. And this is really important if you're actually trying to access like someone's simulation. You want to be able to verify a behavior. You don't want to know how the code works. You want to be able to actually work with the code.
Yep. Yep.
So all of that is bad. And on top of that, like actually not being able to give the right people credit for the work, having documentation that's not necessarily linked to the thing you actually want, you've now also potentially put all sorts of information about your code behind a paywall. So a lot of journals out there, yay, right, really bad, are not necessarily open source. And so if you're trying to make it so people really know about your code, you've put your stuff potentially behind a paywall, and if you don't have the resources to make your stuff open access, that's kind of the only option you have often. So that stinks. I could just kind of go on and on about all the reasons why a software paper is not great, but that's not gonna get us anywhere in terms of just complaining. But the point is, this is kind of the hack that the community has come up with, is they want to be able to cite something that has like a persistent identifier.
Right.
A paper. Did you have a question?
I was just going to make the comment that some of this has arisen also as a result of a culture change over, I'd say, maybe the last 15, maybe 20 years, where previously software was not to be discussed. In fact, it was explicitly forbidden in the journals. Everything was private, and you had to know somebody and do the right handshake. And in the last 20 years, there's sort of been this move to transparency in software of, putting your work out there so that other people, as you mentioned, could verify it, a particular result with it, or use it for a new purpose. And so all this is sort of coming to a head of a change in culture, a change in transparency, and how do you cite this stuff, and so on.
Well, I think too, for the longest time, software was not seen as a scholarly object.
Right.
So it was seen as kind of a tool or part of a method, but not in itself an intellectual contribution. And so that, I think, has started to change too, particularly as people are starting to develop like soup to nuts their own stuff. Like, I'm writing this entirely in Python from the ground up, instead of using libraries and things like that for things like IRAF or proprietary tools. So it's not just a tool anymore, it's actually intellectually valuable. And so the shift then has to go towards citing software. So how do you actually cite software directly? In our paper, I hope, a compelling argument for why you should cite software directly, but the mechanism for actually citing software directly is relatively new. So rather than citing something like a GitHub repository, any other URL or something like that, which is, again, and it's another thing that is not going to be, I didn't get into URLs. So a URL is fragile. It's a really fragile thing, because you think about that as like your address, but things at an address change. Yep. So if I wanted to, so they also break. Everyone's hit a 404 page before. So like you're developing on GitHub and you actually want to change the owner of the repo. And so now the URL is different and it's broken. Yep. Right, or you change the title. There's all these ways that this is not okay. But persistent identifiers are things that, like DOIs, like what makes a DOI special? It's basically, there's nothing magic about it. It's just that someone is maintaining information about where the file associated with it actually is, right. And they're keeping that location up to date. The persistent identifier is associated with things that change, but the identifier itself does not change. Right. You have archives and publishers and trusted entities with these really long histories and missions to maintain those digital objects and access to them. They maintain those identifiers. So we make the case that in order to cite software, give individual people access to code and give individual people credit for the code that they wrote, and future people down the line the ability to learn from everything you did with your code, you need to actually archive your software. You need to publish it. Yes. Versus hosting it and distributing it. So you might distribute it on a website, but this isn't the same as archiving it, minting an identifier, making it indexable by an entity like the ADS. All of that extra work that has to be done, and it is work, curation is work, has to be done by someone else. And so we're kind of making the case that moving forward, if we want to avoid the problem where people are citing things that are not the software, if they're citing anything at all, people need to archive code, and then people need to actually cite archived code. Correct. So this is the goal. The paper then we wanted to do is give a little background as to like why this needs to be thought about. And our methods then, and what we did was we did a case study analyzing all of the past citation paper behaviors that astronomers have had, so that we could better understand what we need to do to get to the place where we've got people archiving software and citing archived software. So what are all the behaviors we need to change so that that's something that's possible? So to do this, and you can scroll down a bit in the methods, we defined a case study. So it's not possible to look at all the software that astronomers have ever made and do this kind of work to analyze the past behavior. So what we did is we tried very hard to identify a small corpus of software packages that kind of represent a spectrum of different types of software. Some are really kind of narrow libraries developed by small groups. Some are whole data reduction pipeline code bases. Mm-hmm. And to look at how these actually showed up in the literature, did people cite them? They're represented across a really wide range of dates. So the date range we thought would be good. We'd expect, if people wanted to give them credit, to have them show up. And what we did is we started, we worked with the AAS to make it so we could look through 23 years of articles for mentions of these pieces of software to see, okay, how did people do these citations? So if you can scroll down a little bit, after we picked out software packages, it wasn't as easy as just wanting to do what a lot of people end up doing. If you just go to where there's aliases, oh geez, the order, yeah, software aliases. Yes. This isn't as simple as we're just going to search for the titles of the software. And we did this purposefully. So, because some people could come up with lots of examples of pieces of software that have relatively unique names. Like my name is Daina Bouquin, and I know there's not another Daina Bouquin out there, at least right now, not yet. And so searching for my name is pretty easy, but there's a lot of ways that that falls down on its face, which is why we need persistent identifiers for people. Hence, we all ask you to get an ORCID. So we picked software packages that had a lot of what we called aliases. So like, for instance, TARDIS is a acronym, like, or even something as simple as AstroPy. It used to be called Astrophysics. So things that had lots of different names and lots of different identifiers and URLs associated with them. So people could cite something that is a title, they could mention something in text, they could mention a subroutine of a software package. There were so many different ways that people could actually decide they're going to give this software credit. And so we actually came up with for our 9 software packages that we picked, we came up with over 400 ways that people could have identified them in the literature.
Wow.
Right. And that even had some limitations. So we included in our alias list, you'll see here, preferred citations. So things that people actually overtly were asking other people to do in order to cite their software. So preferred citations have become, just again, as a normative phenomena. People want their code to be cited, so they try to tell people how to cite their code. And what we found is there's often a proliferation of those kinds of instructions, and they're not even consistent across the different platforms or places where you might find the code. The preferred citations go out of date. So we found multiple preferred citations to go with each of the software packages, in addition to them having lots of different name variations and URLs and identifiers associated with them. So identifiers could be things like papers. It could be archival releases of the software. But so lots of different aliases were found. And we wound up taking this long list of aliases then and doing a content analysis. So if you scroll down a bit, so this is just, in our paper we discuss a bit some of the issues around preferred citations and where they go out of date. Oh, and before, if you could stop here, because I should point out the limitations of this before I get into what we did with the content analysis. So with the content analysis itself, on top of this being a case study and having its own limitations, we actually really constrained a bit what we were gonna kind of allow into our alias list, because we realized as we were gathering up all of these different names, we could kind of go off the rails and make it so that our results, we'd get too many results. We wouldn't actually be able to review them. For instance, Demos, we decided, so Spec2D is one of the software packages we decided to include, and it's associated with a survey, and Demos is part of the way that people describe all the work that's associated with this software package. But Demos is also the name of a Martian moon. So if you do a search for Demos in the ADS, you're gonna get a whole bunch of stuff that has nothing to do with Spec2D. Similarly, there were some packages where, for instance, there were just so many URLs, there were hundreds of URLs to subroutines and different kinds of documentation associated with the code that we just could not include at all. So we know actually that our results probably don't really even encompass all the things we could have found. And
it's not complete, but of the ones you got, it's thorough.
Yes, of the ones we included, we know that it's thorough, but we know we also pretty much just decided these are, the likelihood of them coming up in the literature is pretty small. So we did our best to make it so we could really find everything, but with some understanding. And also the ones that we did decide to include did introduce a lot of confounding variables that we hadn't necessarily anticipated at first. So the software package Stingray. Stingray is one of the vaguest words that you could use as like a title for a software package, we wound up finding and having to weed through things for like the Stingray Nebula, or lots of instruments that are called Stingray. We even found mentions of the Corvette, the Stingray.
Awesome. In the
Yeah, so
literature, that's fantastic.
yes, so it was amazing. We found actual animals too, like stingrays, the animal. So just doing this content analysis, we were trying to say like, okay, well, what are all the ways that someone mentioned these 9 software packages?
Yeah.
We know we threw some things out with the bathwater. So this is the best we could do.
Sure.
And we did 2 searches. So as you get into the results of, we took all of these aliases, we threw them at 2 different sources of information to figure out how people have mentioned these in literature. And one of them was the AAS's XML. So XML is kind of the source material that's used to generate your articles. And it has lots of markup in it, and it's a horrible format to try to work with, but it's very rich. And so not only were we able to say, okay, well, who mentioned one of these aliases for the software package? How did they mention it? So did they put it in a bibliographic entry? Did they just mention it in the text? Did they put it in a footnote? Is it in an acknowledgement? Is it in a table? Is it in a caption?
Right.
So what is like, what is citation is kind of what we got into here. And I mean, the variety of places where people wound up putting them was crazy, but we wound up finding a lot of papers. So just in the AAS XML, we still managed to find like, I think it was like 1,700 papers. I don't remember the exact numbers in here, but we found like a large proportion, a surprising proportion. I think if you scroll up, actually, I don't remember exactly how many. Yeah, so 2% of the papers. So that, I mean, it sounds like a little number, but we looked through everything in the AAS's hands at that point in 2018. And we only looked for 9 software packages. 2% of the papers contained mentions of that software. And we thought that that was like really important to note, because this is older material that we're looking through. So just at a random grab, you're still finding, you know, it's like 1,500 papers had mentioned the software and had tried to give the software credit.
Right.
So you look like you're going to ask something.
No, I'm with you. Yeah, the 2% may not seem large, but given the sample size, it's actually fairly substantial, because there's clearly many more software packages than that, and they get cited. So, or at least we hope they get cited.
Well, yeah, they get mentioned is at first what we wanted to say.
Okay,
so it's like they're getting mentioned. Because a citation is machine actionable. It's something like you could pull up and say, how many people cited my paper, and ADS will tell you. And that's not happening magically. It's happening because there's like a mechanism there to work with formal machine actionable citations. And we're thinking that, at least in the past, the recent past, that software needs to be cited. People basically have come up with software citation policies to try to encourage citation.
Yes.
But people are mentioning software in the literature, so what's going wrong? So basically what we found, and so if you scroll down, that we found, one, people are actually really mentioning a lot of software in the literature. It's getting mentioned, so you can stop here. But the problem is the things that they're using. What are the aliases that are coming up in the literature, and where are those mentions happening? So it turns out they're not all happening in bibliographies. They're not all happening in reference sections.
Right.
And they're not actually linked to the code. They're linked to things like software papers, if they're linked to software papers. Not always software papers. Like I said, the number of different types of aliases we found was pretty great. So if you scroll down to table 6,
look at that.
so you'll see like, the thing that was, I think, craziest for me is that the length of time that the software has been around is not indicative of how much variety people use in actually talking about it. So we found 21 different ways that people talked about or mentioned AstroPy. We found 18 for RADMC. Like, there are, for every single one of our software packages, there was more than one way that people actually mentioned it. And we found lots of articles. So we started with, okay, well, people are mentioning the software. Where are they mentioning it? And how many of those could we actually classify as a citation? So if you scroll down a bit, you'll see these alias locations, table 10. So you'll see, it looks like we've got bibliographic entries for lots of citations, but not all of them. And I'll explain here a little bit that the acknowledgements are often counted as bibliographic entries. So they're sort of inclusive, but not always. So you can have kind of one mention count as both an acknowledgement and a bibliographic entry in our study, just because of the way that the XML was formatted. But the point is, we found a lot of papers that did not have either a bibliographic entry, a acknowledgement, or a footnote, but they still mentioned the software. So even if we were trying to say, okay, what if we had a magical tool that could find all these aliases and make it so we could count all of these different ways that people try to give software acknowledgements so that we could quantify how much credit to give software? That's not possible, because it's not possible to predict where people put these things. So if you scroll down a bit further, I think we might have some good examples of
my house. Sorry, Rena.
Fine. So I think we might have some decent examples of places where the mention happened. Yeah, these are the kind of cutouts here, but there was no real credit given. So a couple of these kind of indented quotations are all from papers that we found that mentioned code, but didn't give any kind of attribution.
Yeah.
And they might just say, like, we used astropy.io, we created a diagram, so we just used it, we did it, and this is from a paper from 2017. So not old, and there's not like a norm around doing this necessarily at this point. This is about a year after the software citation policy even got enforced. But there's not like editorial practices that are standard for even how to enforce something like that at this point.
That's correct.
Yeah, so
we can
that is happy to talk all about that. But we found some really interesting things too. So some papers actually did this with 2 of our case study. So you'll see the second column under table 12, the example there. They did that with 2 of our software packages. So this wasn't like one-offs. It might be that a paper mentioned many pieces of software this way without giving any kind of attribution. That wasn't uncommon. We found a couple of those. If you scroll down further, we found that in some cases, people actually were not, they were citing something, but they're saying something else. So again, stop, sorry. Let's go up just a little bit. I'm not driving. So there's, go a little further up. Stop. So where it says, if we considered changing disk radius.
Right here?
Right, yeah. So in cases like this, the citation is actually associated with the software is a paper that has nothing to do with the software. Yeah. So it is another paper that they're citing. They're citing something, but they're citing something else. They're not citing software. They're citing a paper that might have also used this software.
Correct.
Right? So you're giving credit to someone, but you're not giving credit to authors of the code. You're trying to justify your use of the software.
Right.
And in some cases, with this last one, people don't know how to cite some of these different representations of the code. So this Dolmond CP 2012, that's an attempt to cite something called a software registry record, which is a relatively new type of thing. And so this is a really oddly formatted citation that doesn't actually, like, there's mistakes in it, basically. So we would have never picked it up. And it's because people don't know how to cite these kinds of things, and it's easy to misread what they are. So for the AAS XML, this was able to give us kind of like a place to start in understanding what are people using to represent the software, if not the software itself.
Yep.
How are they trying to give people credit, and when is that credit missing? And how many of these, to a certain extent, would have been found at all and counted as a software citation by ADS? The answer is 0.
Yeah.
Because none of these are citations to archived versions of code with persistent identifiers that ADS can index. So after that, we wanted to make sure that our results could be seen outside of the AAS journals. So we took that same list of aliases and we threw it at the ADS API and want to say, what other journals have mentions of this software? And if you scroll down to the figures, actually, we might as well go straight to the figures, because basically, I can say the big takeaway from the ADS API is, one, the results were reflected similarly across non-AAS journals. And two, that the ADS API is not actually designed to do this kind of full text search for lots of different variations of titles. And so it missed about, I think it was 40% of the results we were able to find by doing a straight search of the XML. So the ADS is not optimized for a random query of a software package's name as like, oh, indicator of whether or not that software gets mentioned in the literature. But I think the biggest takeaway from both the ADS API search, our search of the literature, isn't just like the sheer variety of ways that people mentioned this, the issues we have with preferred citations, the tendency to cite things that are not software, but it's that we found the software mentioned over the entire timeline associated with our case study. So this push for software citation assumes that software is not being cited. But what we found is that people have been mentioning software in papers for decades.
Yep.
But people are not actually getting the benefits of those mentions. So it's not just a matter of saying we need to advocate for software citation. It's we need to give people different mechanisms to do it.
Preferably a uniform mechanism or a few uniform mechanisms.
Yes, so I'm happy to start talking more about just like where we go from here and the mechanisms we recommend and things like that. Because
sure. And I'll just say it, right? If you go through this paper, there's you know, the AAS journals has a software policy, and that comes under some criticism in this paper, and that's perfectly fine. So, you know, it's a start, right? We started, so let's make it better. So yeah, let's talk about where we go.
yeah, and I'm happy to talk about.
Do you want me to stay on the paper, or you want to go off?
We can go off of it. I mean,
okay. I'm
happy to talk more about the software citation policy as it exists now, or because I think essentially this AAS has been very progressive in essentially saying software matters. It's a scholarly contribution. It is part of the science and worthy of attribution. And from a historical perspective, it is part of the cultural history of astronomy as well. It's important. But the policy now essentially has some language that sets up some dichotomies. So there's two ways to cite software using the AAS software citation policy. One is citing a paper about the software. And the way that that's presented is that this is a way to give software authors credit. So, but we just agreed though that there are a lot of limitations with your ability to give specific people credit for software using a paper, using this static object that stands in for the code.
Right.
And the other way that it says to cite software is that you could cite archive software as a way to give people access to code. But we know, though, that in order to give specific people credit for code, you need to cite the archived copy of the code. And the reason why people want to cite code is often not because they want to give people access to it. They want to be able to say, this is where you can like learn more about it and things like that. But there's lots of other reasons why people might want to point to the code and cite it.
Sure.
Like they want to point out tutorial material. They want to see like, this is something that was a foundational in the paper prior to this. they might want to say that I used this to as like something as a dependency for my code. They're not trying to give people access to the code, though. They're trying to give that code credit.
Right.
And so the thing the AAS policy says to do is to cite a paper if you want to give people credit.
So it sort of leaves the obvious, but we can talk about it. So what would you do to improve? If you could wave your magic wand, you have a magic wand now. How would you improve that? Is it a language change? Is it a policy change? How would you make it?
I think it's a few things. So I think to start, language is really a very easy thing to fix. So starting by getting rid of this kind of false dichotomy, that's saying that it's important to cite software, and the way that you cite software should give credit to specific people. If you're trying to give credit to specific people and attribute a specific version of software, cite that specific version of the software directly. So if you want to tell someone more about it, you can also cite a paper.
Sure.
There's nothing wrong with that. So I think making it clear that it's okay to cite both of those things, it's not an either or, and getting rid of the kind of setup that the only way to give people credit is to cite a paper.
Fair enough.
So that's kind of like a step one, but I think thinking more about how to give somewhat more nuanced instruction to people about what to do with code that doesn't have a archival release. So you want to cite a piece of software that isn't archived. You want to cite code that's developed, that's old and on someone's website. You want to cite software where the only thing you have is a paper. Like, what are you supposed to do?
Right.
And that takes a little bit more direct instructions and training. And I think making it clear too what a citation is. So the AAS policy also has in it the ability to create something called a software section. And it says, oh, well, you can add a section to your paper that's called software. And so then you have this LaTeX tag for software. And it says this is kind of like giving credit to a facility that you used. But it doesn't say when you should use a software section instead of or in addition to putting something in your references section.
Yeah, fair. Yes.
So there's no instruction for when to do these things. It's kind of like a lot of what we saw with the preferred citations. So people might say, here's many ways that you can give us credit, but when is one preferred over the other? That's not clear.
Right. Right. So I would say probably need to have some policy discussions on how to reword. That's number one. And number two, since even getting authors to use /software is not uniform across different scientific editors, I'll say that. Or even when it is used, it's still a work in progress. It's not part of the culture yet to do it. And so you just gave me a great idea for doing a video series on how to use, how to cite software or how to use /software, if that's going to be the mechanism. Or, you know, when do you put it in a footnote? And, you know, presumably your paper is a great example of when things are in footnotes, when they're in software. Or
it's got a lot of those. And we've also done, like we've worked with AstroBetter. We did a nice like set of in-text citation examples. I've been working with Force 11 and a few other groups that deal with like kind of the future of scholarly communication, coming up with lots of examples and checklists to help people. So there's still kind of the problem though, if it's like thinking work, people still have to think about it. It's not something that is sort of an afterthought or automatic.
correct.
And so you're asking people to have to critically assess a situation and then make an informed decision about the way they will attribute someone's work. Moving beyond that through policy would be really great. Just making things as simple as possible, but not like kind of overshadowing the nuance that the software is different from papers. It's a completely different thing that we're trying to give credit. Right. And also, I should say some of the follow-up work we're trying to do might end up being useful. So one of the things we're trying to do is acknowledge the fact that people are going to continue citing software papers. This is like a hack. It's a workaround. until we get to like the magical world where people cite software directly, right?
Yes.
So just acknowledging that, one of the things I'm starting as a collaboration with University of Washington, some people out there, doing some natural language processing studies to try to see if we
The
can
Dirac Institute or something?
yeah, we're doing Wolfgang.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Basically, one of the ideas we have is to try to characterize what a software paper is. Because right now, citations to software papers for the purpose of citing software versus citing them for any other reason is completely indistinguishable. But you can still at least maybe say a citation to this paper in particular should be counted as a citation for the software. Because right now we can't do that.
Yeah, it's not really fun. So, you know,
working on that.
I don't know. I'll look in my crystal ball. Maybe you can look in yours as well. But it is a culture change as well, right? It's a culture change. It's policy change. Policy changes happens relatively shortly. Culture changes longer term. But you know, maybe in 10 years, maybe in 20 years, we'll get to this magical place that you mentioned.
Well, I'd like to think too, though, that we're kind of in a context where this matters so much to early career scientists.
Absolutely.
They want to, if it's not fixed, the consequences, we have a brain drain from astronomy that's even worse than what we have now. People put their blood, sweat, and tears into their code, and it's not treated as scholarly. It doesn't give them credit. They can't build their careers on it. There are all these horrendous consequences for not fixing it. I'm actually optimistic that people will do the work once they understand why they ought to. The problem of fixing how to cite things that are old code is a harder problem than trying to get developers now to adopt new practices. Is sort of how I'm seeing it, at least. Maybe I'm not even an idiot.
No, that's right. And at some level, that problem will go away because code that is not maintained develops bit rot. It doesn't port to the next generation of machines, et cetera, et cetera. And so older, you know, you don't find software packages cited from 50 years ago.
But don't you? I will challenge you on that one. I get requests.
Name one.
I've been asked by, so think of patron privacy. I was asked by someone, Johnson at Johnson Air Base, for tethered flight control software written in Fortran from the like early 80s. They were looking to see it.
Okay.
So it was not, it was mentioned in a paper, but they could not find it. They could not access it. People still want to access these things much later, but they're not going to be accessed for those same reasons. They're not going to be
true. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, it's not going to be like because we want to use it. We don't want to run. Right. Though I want there to be a world where we can emulate all of the software, emulate all the things. But
that would be great. Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Yes.
And software is treated actually in copyright law as literature. So just wait 50 years for like what the world of code studies looks like.
Awesome. Well, I just want to say, I think your paper is really lovely. I think it's a fantastic first step in shining a quantitative light on the issue. I really appreciate it. So thanks for writing it.
Thank you for like the chance to rant about it.
Oh, I'm happy to have you rant about it. In fact, I look forward to your next one so we can do rant 2. We make a whole series of rants here. It'd be great. Well, this was a different one to do for people, but it was great. Daina, I want to thank you so much for your time this afternoon, and thank you for sharing your paper with us.
Thanks for the chance to talk.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you on the next one. Bye-bye.